Welcome to the Brattleboro Literary Festival. I'm Tim Weed, a member of the author committee and local writer. This year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, Brattleboro Community Television, the Stepansky Family Trust, the Thompson Trust, the Vermont Arts Council, the Vermont Humanities Council, and the Wyndham Foundation. We would also like to thank our advertisers, and we encourage you to support them. The festival is run entirely by volunteers, but has very real expenses. Your donations allow us to present the festival every year. We encourage you to contribute using the QR code on the donor cards to donate online, or to use the donation boxes you'll see at various venues. We can't do it without you, and we really appreciate your support. Please take a moment now to turn the ringer off on your cell phone, but please do use your cell phone to take photos and share them with us on social media. We are very fortunate today to have two extremely talented writers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce both of them and then just turn the show over to them, and they'll have a conversation. There'll be time at the end for you to ask questions, and we're also going to leave time. The books are for sale in the back and for these authors to sign. So this is an incredible duo who I can also count as personal friends of mine. And
because we're in the same writing group together
we're in
with
the same
Tim.
writing group, yep. So I'll introduce them, and then I know they're perfectly capable of holding their own on the stage. So, as you'll see. Angie Kim moved as a preteen from Seoul, South Korea to the suburbs of Baltimore. After graduating from the Interlochen Arts Academy, she studied philosophy at Stanford and attended Harvard Law School, where she was an editor at the Harvard Law Review. Her debut novel, Miracle Creek, won the Edgar Award, the ITW Thriller Award, the Strand Critics Award, and the Pinkley Prize, and was named one of the best books of the year by Time, the Washington Post, Kirkus Reviews, and the Today Show. Angie's new novel, Happiness Falls, has also taken the publishing world by storm, in the process receiving all kinds of well-deserved accolades. In the Starred Review, Kirkus wrote, "The claim that a book will change your life often seems like exaggeration. Here, the potential is real." And Vermont's own Chris Bojalian wrote, "Happiness Falls is a rarity, a riveting page-turner about a missing man and a precise and luminous exploration of what it's like to be the teens he has left behind. The twists are surprising and the turns are moving. You will fall in love with this family and this novel. It is a treasure." Angie lives in Northern Virginia with her family. And, yes, go ahead. And we're also extremely privileged to have Jean Kwok here. Jean is the award-winning New York Times and international best-selling author of Searching for Sylvie Lee, Girl in Translation, and Mambo in Chinatown. An instant New York Times bestseller, Searching for Sylvie Lee was selected for The Read with Jenna Today Show Book Club and featured in the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, CNN, the New York Post, the Washington Post, O Magazine, People, Entertainment Weekly, and more. Jean immigrated from Hong Kong to Brooklyn when she was 5 and worked in a Chinatown clothing factory for much of her childhood while living in an unheated, roach-infested apartment. Hopefully she'll tell us something about that today. It's a very interesting story. In between her undergraduate degree at Harvard and an MFA in fiction at Columbia, she worked for 3 years as a professional ballroom dancer. Jean's new novel is The Leftover Woman, about which Booklist wrote in a starred review, Kwok brings her signature lyrical prose to the novel, while suspense simmers in the background. Highly recommended. And Elle, naming it one of their best books of 2023, called it a heart-wrenching examination of transracial adoption and its influence on the lives of a Chinese-American child and the two mothers who love her. Not only a suspenseful read, but also an introspective journey into the bonds of family, country, class, and race. Jean is trilingual, fluent in Dutch, Chinese, and English, and studied Latin for several years. She divides her time, I think this is still true, between the Netherlands and New York City. True?
Yes.
Okay, let's have a hand for Jean as well. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you all so much, and especially thank you to Tim, who, like Angie said earlier, is not only a friend, but is a member of a very small writing group that Angie and me are in. So this is a very special event for us because we actually not only know each other very well, but we read each other's drafts and have worked on our books together from their inception.
Yeah, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming out on this Sunday, the last day of this amazing literary festival. And we're so excited to be here. And I think we're going to start by just telling you a little bit about like the elevator pitch for our books, for those of you who haven't read, and then maybe doing a quick little reading. Do you want to get us started, Jean?
Yes, and don't run away. The reading is going to be very short. You will not fall asleep, we swear. So my book is The Leftover Woman, and it's about what happens in China when a young woman gives birth and is told shortly afterwards that her baby had died. And she finds out a couple of years later that her daughter had not died, but had been placed for adoption by her no-good husband. That's my favorite part. By her no-good husband to a wealthy American couple, a casualty of China's one-child policy. And when the novel opens, Jasmine, the birth mother, has followed her baby to New York City to try to get her back. And the book is told from two points of view, from that of Jasmine, the birth mother, but also of Rebecca. And Rebecca is affluent, with a handsome husband, high-powered career, a beautiful home, and an adopted Chinese daughter she adores. And I really do try to be sympathetic to both women's stories in the book. Both absolutely love their child, but they are on a collision course. So I'm going to read just about a page from the first chapter, which is from Jasmine's point of view. And Jasmine has paid the Chinese mafia to get her to the US. So she now owes them a huge amount of money that she is not able to repay since she doesn't have the education or the skills to really get a job, and she doesn't speak English. So this is her trying to get a job in a restaurant. A small man wearing a wrinkled gray suit, much too big for him, exited the kitchen and approached me. He looked as tired as his faded eyes. "You looking for work? What's your name?" I started to push my glasses up my nose, then realized I'd taken them off. I felt exposed without them, especially with the two women watching us. How many times had I already had this conversation? Could I trust him not to report me? I stared at his shoes. I'm a very hard worker. He barked out a laugh. "Let me guess. You don't have the right paperwork, and you want me to give you a job, even though you're too scared to even tell me your real name. Forget it." He waved a dismissive hand and turned to leave. "I can clean tables, waitress, serve dim sum. I'm dexterous and have a good memory." My heart was racing. I was talking too quickly. I couldn't return to China and my disastrous life there. I closed my eyes. I'd passed a menu board on the way in. What had it said? "Your specials today are braised pork and gravy, shrimp with vermicelli and garlic, and vegetarian crystal dumplings." He paused. "Can you come in full time?" "A few nights a week." He shrugged. "I have people lining up to work 24 hours a day, especially if they're in your situation." In my peripheral vision, I noticed both women perk up as a young man stepped past us on his way to the kitchen. He was hunched over, his head averted, as if trying to make himself less conspicuous. He wore a navy jacket with an elaborate emblem on the sleeve. A worn guitar case was slung over his back. The manager spotted him and erupted like a bulldog confronting a Doberman in the street. "What do you think this is? A storage area?" The beleaguered man took a deep breath, but didn't stop. "I'm so sorry. I'll stash the guitar. You won't notice." There was something familiar about his warm tenor that called to me. I didn't recognize the voice, rather the inflection of his Chinese, the rhythm of his words. I tended to avoid young men with their grabby hands and clinging eyes, but I was riveted to this one. His hair was dark and silky, the gleam of amber highlights visible even in the fluorescent lighting. "Come here!" The manager actually stomped his foot. The man slowly turned towards us, and when he caught sight of me, he froze. My heart lurched. I stared into a face that I both knew and didn't know at all. 2 thick slashes of eyebrows, dusky skin, a square masculine face with eyes like melted chocolate. Anthony. He was etched into my soul and yet entirely new to me. I remembered gangly shoulders, a broad open grin, thin fingers plucking on guitar strings while perched on the steps of his house, one of the largest in our village. Then his family moved away, and it stood empty, with me staring into the blank windows day after day. My eyes rested upon the man, but my soul recognized a boy I hadn't seen in 10 years, my best friend when I was 14 years old. He was gaping at me. Then he whispered, "It's you."
Hi, I'm Angie, and this is my book, Happiness Falls. And it is a story about a family in crisis. It opens when the father of this biracial Korean-American family goes missing, and the only person who might know what happened, who was with him, is 14-year-old Eugene, his youngest son, who cannot speak. He has a rare genetic condition called Angelman syndrome, as well as autism. And so the family has to really come together and figure out how to connect with each other in order to figure out what might have happened to the father, and also to protect Eugene from the police, who are very suspicious about the role that 14-year-old Eugene might have sort of had in his father's disappearance. And one of the things that the family really has to do, of course, is try to figure out how to communicate with Eugene and figure out if that's even possible. And so the whole story is told in first person by Mia, his 20-year-old older sister, who is actually home from college reluctantly. And she is telling us the entire story from a little bit after it's happened. And part 1 that I'll be reading from is called Everyone's Fine. And spoiler alert, everyone is not fine. And chapter 1 is Lock, Bok, and K-pop. We didn't call the police right away. Later, I would blame myself, wonder if things might have turned out differently if I hadn't shrugged it off, insisting Dad wasn't missing, but just delayed, probably still in the woods looking for Eugene, thinking he'd run off somewhere. Mom says it wasn't my fault, that I was merely being optimistic, but I know better. I don't believe in optimism. I believe there's a fine line, if any, between optimism and willful idiocy. So I try to avoid optimism altogether, lest I fall over the line mistakenly. My twin brother, John, keeps trying to make me feel better too, saying we couldn't have known something was wrong because it was such a typical morning, which is an asinine thing to say. Because why would you assume things can't go wrong simply because they haven't yet? Life isn't geometry. Terrible, life-changing moments don't happen predictably at the bottom of a linear slope. Tragedies and accidents are tragic and accidental precisely because of their unexpectedness. Besides, labeling anything about our family typical, I just have to shake my head. I'm not even thinking about the typical adjacent stuff like John's and my boy-girl twin thing, our biracial mix, Korean and white, untraditional parental gender roles, working mom, stay-at-home dad, or different last names. Parson for dad plus Park for mom equals the mashed-up Parkson for us kids. Not common, certainly, but hardly shocking in our area these days. Where we are indubitably, inherently atypical is with my little brother Eugene's dual diagnosis, autism and a rare genetic disorder called mosaic Angelman syndrome, which means he can't talk, has motor difficulties, and this is what fascinates many people who've never heard of Angelman. has an unusually happy demeanor with frequent smiles and laughter. Thank you.
So I have to tell all of you that this is a really kind of special moment for us. I mean, for me especially, to hear Angie read from her book, because we read each other's books when they were drafts, when they were just Word documents and, you know, a mess. And all we had was just a beginning. And, you know, if there's something, Tim is in our writing group, so he has heard the whining from close up. You know, there's this moment where the book has enough gravitas that it will proceed to the end, but there's a very, very long slope to that where you just feel a kind of despair that will this story ever work itself out? Can I ever take it to its real conclusion? And for us personally, it's a really beautiful moment to be here together. I think this is the only dual event we're actually doing together. Angie was kind enough to do a special pre-launch event for me. We talked a little bit about her book, but it was mainly about my launch. But this is really a dual event for us, talking about our two books that we actually coincidentally wrote together and yet somehow came out within a month of each other.
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I got to hear Jean read from her book about, when was it? Like a week ago? Your book just came out. I can't even remember what the days kind of all blurred together when you're on book tour. And so I got a chance to read that, and I got all teary at that time, and just sort of thinking about how we had come so far, because it is such a huge, long journey to get from there to here. And I think I read the first draft of the first pages. I posted it on social media. I think it was like April of 2021 or something like that. Some crazy long time ago. And so this is really, really special. So thank you so much. But let's get started on talking about some of the things that our books have in common. And I feel like one of the things that we talked about last week is just this idea of the family drama and the family dynamics and what it's like to be involved in this complicated family, dynamic where you're kind of like in the middle of this turmoil and trying to figure out how to sort of claw your way out of that.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely true. And as Angie was reading, I was thinking one of the things that I loved so much about her book, Happiness Falls, was that you really fall in love with all the family members in it. They're so... they can be really annoying too, but that's what makes you love them. They're not stereotypical in any way. You really do just kind of feel and pull for them in every way. In my book, I have my two point of view characters are Jasmine and Rebecca, and they are the birth mom and the adoptive mom of the novel. And it was important to me to make them both sympathetic, and there was a point in the early reads when somebody said to me, not from our writing group, you should really make Rebecca, the adoptive mom, into the villain of the book. And it would work really well. Jasmine could kind of be fighting her the entire way and, triumph or not triumph at the end. And I said, but I love Rebecca. And Angie backed me up then. Yeah. I thought I love Rebecca as much as I love Jasmine. And I feel that in a situation of interracial adoption, there's no right answer. Every single situation is different, and both the birth mother and the adoptive mother have rights and make mistakes. And you can't say, well, the child should also always go with this mom or with that mom. But it was a real thing for me to develop both of these, because Jasmine she's poor, she's young, she's the underdog, fighting to get her baby back. Rebecca's affluent, but she's also very much like me and like us in that she's a modern career woman trying to keep all of those balls up in the air, and she is making mistakes, but she is truly doing her best.
Yeah. Absolutely.
How did you feel about your family members and the development of your characters?
Yeah, it's so strange to think about, because this family has been with me for so long. So I started writing in my 40s. Unlike Jean, I don't have an MFA. I being a writer is actually my 5th career. I was a lawyer, and I was a business person. I did consulting, and then I was a stay-at-home mom for a long time. And I started writing because I have 3 boys, and all 3 are fine now. I'm like knocking on wood. And but they, as babies, they all had medical issues, and so it's something that writing is something that I started doing just for catharsis, just to make sense of and process what I had gone through. And I wrote my first novel, Miracle Creek, which came out 4.5 years ago, is really about that parenting angle, what it's like to be the mother, and to make some of those sacrifices and things. And this family is actually from a short story that is one of the first short stories that I wrote 13 years ago, and it was published in 2013. And Mia, who was 14 at that time, the same narrator, and here in this novel, she's 20. And so she's become a little more know-it-all, a little more like, kind of like, I went to college, I'm in college now, so I know everything, unlike my parents, who are kind of like these blobs, right? And so she doesn't really see them as real people. And so that voice just kind of, has stayed with me. And as my kids grew older, I remember thinking, like, oh, I wonder what's happening with Mia and John. I wonder, like, if they're applying to the same colleges. John is Mia's fraternal twin. And, and I bet, I wonder what essays they're writing for college. And, almost like they were real people. And so when I started actually drafting this novel, and I decided that the inciting incident is the father going missing, it made me so upset for this family, because I feel like I know them, and I feel like they're kind of almost real in some ways. They're a biracial family just like mine. And so it really kind of propelled me. And the way that I write, I don't know what's going to happen really until the end. And so for several years, I had no idea what happened to the father, whether he was alive or dead. Maybe he was like off to Tahiti and, having like this fabulous affair, whatever, and in which case I would have been so upset with him. And so all of these things happening, and so it really got me to sort of come to my writing closet. I write in an actual closet every day and get my butt in gear and, start writing, because I needed to figure out what happened to this family. And I do think that that's another thing that our books share in common, is this core of kind of like suspense and mystery, because you have a prologue that sort of mentions something happening in the future involving a lot of blood. And so you're just like, oh, I know something's going to happen. And of course, I have the missing person mystery too, right?
No, absolutely. And I think Angie and I were both very concerned when we were writing a book that, obviously deals with many themes and has depth and is thought-provoking, but that is also a really fun read. A book that's going to kind of suck you in, and you come out a couple of hours later and you think, oh my gosh, wow, I really needed to know what happened in that novel. And that's something that for some people might come naturally, but does not come naturally to me. Like, I have to do a lot of thinking about how to make that happen. And, they say from my book, The Leftover Women, the punchline is something like 2 mothers, 2 worlds, 1 impossible choice. And like Angie was saying about struggling with what did happen to that father at the end, I was like, well, what does happen to that kid at the end?
Yeah.
And, you read the book and you're like, what happens to her? Because the easy way out would be if one of the women was less sympathetic than the other. And you may well be Team Jasmine or Team Rebecca, but there's a real argument to be either one. There's a very valid argument to be behind either of these women. So it's not like the book is giving you an indication that, well, this is really the good mom. The kid's got to go with her at the end. And so as the writers, we are the ones who have to solve this impossible dilemma. You guys get to go along for the ride, but we're like, oh no, well, how am I going to make this work out in a way that won't have mobs running after me with pitchforks at the end? And I didn't want to cop out and say, oh, they share the child. I wanted there to be a clear decision. And so for me, it took a lot of massaging to figure out how to have the book come to a surprising yet meaningful and emotional ending that hopefully you don't expect. But I will tell you that in the writing of this book, at some point, basically every single character was like in jail, in bed with each other, or dead. Like I had killed everyone off at some point, and my editor was like, Jean, no, like bring them back. Do not kill off all the characters we love. Like, that was not a good move. So
yeah, absolutely. For me, it's funny because I think of the mystery element of this novel as kind of a Trojan horse. So, the missing father is something that hopefully hooks people in, and it certainly hooked me in as far as writing of it. But once you sort of get in there and hopefully are turning the pages, that we use that to sort of explore what happens to this family as they're trying to figure out what each other is and what secrets the father has and things like that. Not only in terms of solving the mystery of what happened to the father, of course the family is very invested in that, but even more importantly, possibly, trying to really learn about each other. And so I talked about Eugene being a non-speaking child. That's something that I knew that I wanted to do from the get-go, is figure out how that plays into this story. It's something that's really, really important to me. Jean and I both, are immigrants to this country. I came over from Korea when I was 11 years old, so in middle school, which is such a hard time anyway, and I didn't speak any English. So overnight, I went from feeling like a pretty smart girl who was, doing well in school and with lots of friends, outgoing, to all of a sudden not being able to speak. And of course, that was so fraught, and it was frustrating, the miscommunication and being unable to figure out logistics even of what was happening in the classroom and things like that. But even more than that, I felt so much shame because I didn't really realize until then how much in our society we equate oral fluency with intelligence. And so all of a sudden, I felt stupid. I felt like a pabo, which is a Korean word that means like kind of a stupid person. And so it was something that has been with me for a really, really long time. And even to this day, I have a lot of insecurities, and I think it really comes from that time. And then I learned about maybe like 7-8 years ago that there are these kids that I know, dear friends, children, who have autism, and some of them have Angelman syndrome, who are non-speakers, who actually we had all assumed couldn't read, couldn't write, who didn't have any thoughts, had severe cognitive delays. And it turned out that they could actually communicate by spelling out words, one letter at a time. And it was such a huge thing to hear some of the things that they were talking about, how they were in there, but they had no way to express the thoughts that were trapped in their minds. And so it's something that I really wanted to explore through this book with Eugene. And of course, because his narrator sister, Mia, didn't know that about him, we as readers go on that journey with him. And that really was at the core of what I wanted to sort of use the story to explore and interrogate about our society. Why do we have these beliefs, and how can we help that message get out, that just because you can't speak doesn't mean that you can't understand or think. So that's the message that I'm hoping people will take away from this book. What about you? Can you talk a little bit more about like the origins of your story and what messages you were hoping? Because I know that there was so much about the China's one-child policy and things like that, and how we see each other.
No, absolutely. And you know what's great about doing these events with other writers is that you find out so many of us are thinking about the same themes or coming from a similar type of background, but you express it so differently in your work. And so, like Angie, I am indeed also an immigrant. We were incredibly poor. I came when I was younger. I came when I was 5, and we lived in an unheated apartment in New York City for most of my childhood. I worked in a factory in Chinatown, and the worst thing was really that in my household, as a kind of dreamy, clumsy young Chinese girl, I was really not considered a good daughter. And so I didn't speak any English either. I did terribly in school. But also, you know, I'm the youngest of 7 children. I am female, so all of this was wrong. You know, the hierarchy is determined by age and gender. And so I was at rock bottom, and I was not allowed to look my brothers or father in the eye. You know, when somebody got married, a male relative would roll over the bed in hopes of the bed bringing forth male offspring. And of course, in China, we have the one-child policy, which suddenly came down and said every single family is allowed to have one child only, or there will be severe penalties, like losing your job, a year's salary of fines, you know, shame. I mean, really huge, impossible penalties. And what happened as a result of that is that today there are 32 million more Chinese men in China than women. And the birth rate is 50-50. So what happened to the other 32 million, right? That is the question. And one of the things that happened is, you know, something like in the novel, which is that Jasmine gave birth, her baby disappeared, or she thought it died, but had actually been placed for adoption. And of course, there are legal adoptions. I mean, I'm not saying they're all illegal, but Jasmine was very much born from my own feeling of being unseen and unheard and being powerless in a certain type of society. Rebecca, on the other hand, who is powerful and a career woman, is also very much a part of me because she's a publishing executive. And so it's an insider's look at publishing, at the craziness that Angie and I have really talked a lot about in the publishing world, that these unspoken rules that you are somehow supposed to know. So it's all about that. But, you know, Rebecca's also about what it's like to be a modern woman and to be really trying your best. I remember when my kids were little and we were flying with my husband, and on the airplane, he changed the baby's diaper. And to hear the flight attendants, it was like the Messiah had come. You know, it was like such a clever man changing the diaper. Oh, so lovely and emancipated and, you know, handsome too. And, you know, and I'm sitting there like,
hello, I've been changing diapers all the time.
I have changed diapers in the past, one or two, you know. And basically, all the flight attendants pretty much lined up and sang in chorus, "Nobody cares." Like, nobody cared that I basically took care of the baby all the time. And I think that's something that happens to women, that we are judged harshly, and we judge ourselves harshly, and we are trying to do it all, and we are killing ourselves trying to do it all, and it's somehow never good enough. And that is Rebecca's story.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know how we're doing.
Would you? So Angie, what else? You were talking about what you wanted people to bring away from the book. Is there something else you'd like to add?
Yeah. No. I think. I think that's. You know. That was one of the big things. about this book that I sort of had in mind. I was just thinking about, when you just asked this question, I was like, oh, I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
And I remembered one of the things that I had up in my writing wall that guided my writing of this, that was sort of a way for me to remember what I wanted this book to be about, was I had this Venn diagram, and it had 3 circles on it. So the top circle, the A story, was the missing father, investigation arc. The second circle was about this thing that I told you about with non-speakers and oral fluency not being equivalent to communication. And then the third circle was the happiness quotient. So it's a theory that the missing father in this book has, and we learn, and the family didn't know about this before he went missing, is that he actually is obsessed with happiness. And I think I'm obsessed with happiness too, obviously. And it really came out of, again, like just the sort of outward appearance of happiness for Angelman kids, and how they have these smiles, which is in the brief reading that I did in the beginning. And also my own sort of thinking about happiness, and in my life, what does happiness mean, sort of at the micro and at the macro level. And again, I think it goes back to my experience in Korea versus here. Because in Korea, we were so poor, we had no running water. And so when we got the visa to come to the US, we were told like, oh, you've won the lottery. And it was like we had, and we were supposed to be happy, and I was told that I was happy here. And of course, because of my experience with not speaking the language, and also not being with my parents at all because they were working so hard at a grocery store, it was like I was basically never seeing them. I was quite miserable here. And so trying to make sense out of that sort of objective marker of the should be happy versus the subjective, like, but I don't feel that, why? And that disconnect is something I've thought about a lot. And so the father tries to make sense of it by saying, happiness is relative. It's relative to your expectations and to your baseline. And Jean, it's so funny because it was the evening before your pub date that we were last together, and we were talking about The Leftover Woman. And one of the things that I was thinking so much about, especially that night, about with your book coming out the next day, so both our books were going to be in bookstores together and things like that, is really thinking about the baseline of ourselves as writers. And it really brought me back to what I think of, or what I try to keep in mind as our baseline, which is when we were talking to each other and to Tim, and when we were in the middle of writing the stories, and we would be like talking to each other and being like, I have no idea if we can actually do justice to the story. What is the ending? I don't know. Do you know? Can you brainstorm with me? And not having any faith that we were going to actually find, well, no, I think we had faith, but we just didn't know exactly how we were going to get there. And then, like, being there with both our books in hand with each other, it was just like remembering that 2 years ago, when we were starting to write these stories, we would have killed to be in that situation. This is really what we wanted, to be able to have our books with our beautiful jackets in hand. So it just kind of brought it back full circle for me. Well, so that's the other thing. Yeah.
Well, and to add to that, we're both on a very intensive book tours right now. I was driven in right before the panel. I'm getting driven out right after seeing Mary Beth Keene's amazing panel, which is after ours. So I'm going to see a part of that, but then I'm in a car and I have a 5 a.m. flight out, and Angie is on a very exhaustive tour as well, and sometimes it's tiring, like I have a lot of 4 a.m. flights where I'm just getting up, and then you fly somewhere, you land, you do the event, you sleep a couple of hours, and meanwhile you have to do social media, and you have interviews, and you have requests and questions about upcoming things, and you're writing pieces, so there's a lot that's going on. But indeed, a friend of mine said to me, she said, if you could think back to when you were an unpublished writer, you would have given anything to have your life now. And it is so true. It is so much about gratitude and fulfilling your expectations and, kind of being in harmony with the world. And I think we have to go to Q&A soon, but the last thing that I would like to add about The Leftover Women in terms of readers, and, I know that especially some people who have adopted Chinese babies are a little bit afraid to read it. They're very attracted to it, but they're afraid to read it at the same time because they're like, is this book going to break my heart? That's a question I've gotten a lot. And it won't. It's not going to, because this is a novel of unity and harmony. It's a novel that is more about what these two mothers have in common more than what are the issues that divide them. And of course they are in conflict because there's only one child, but ultimately it's about how much we love each other and how much we love our families, which is, I think, what Angie's book is also about.
Yeah, we'd love questions, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I will, if you ask a question, I'll repeat it because this is being filmed for BCTV, so any question, yeah.
For both of you, the first question, the happiness quotient is made up.
So the question is, the happiness quotient is made up?
Yes, the happiness quotient is made up. It's not a real thing. Oh, I mean, it's real to me, but yeah. No, I've gotten that question a lot too, because people have been sort of saying, where did you get this idea from? And certainly I have an author's note in the back where I talk about all of the influences and things like that. But it is one of these things where I have these crazy spreadsheets, and I have been thinking about it for like the last 5-6 years. And at first I thought it was a difference, like, your situation minus your expectations. And I was really focused on the expectations. And I realized just the way that the numbers worked out and things that it was better as a quotient, dividing. And then I realized, it's not about expectations, because if you just keep your expectations really low, then the top number, the happiness number, will be higher. But in the meantime, by virtue of having really low expectations, your today is going to suck, and that's basically what happened with Miracle Creek. I was kind of like, I had that theory when that book was coming out. And so I remember like the week before it was coming out, I tried to keep my expectations really low, like nobody's gonna like it, and nobody's gonna read it, and everybody who reviews it is gonna hate it, but and it did like make me a little bit more grounded, and it made me happier when I got good reviews and things. But it was kind of sucky, and I want to have those like fun expectations and hopes, and those silly fantasies that we authors have and things like that. So that's where the concept of baseline really has been. I've been trying to do it like 3 times a day while, brushing my teeth. Like, okay, remember your baseline. No agent, no book, none of that stuff. Yeah.
So if you haven't read the book yet, the happiness quotient is a really brilliant system that Angie has divided. It's one of the reasons to read the book, because it's actually a really interesting way to approach life, and it's all sort of laid out very well in the book. So.
The follow-up, the part that led is the research part. I learned so much stuff about, being able to speak and learning how to speak, and also what it's like living in a club. So I guess, what kind of research did you
The question is about research, that she got a lot out of both books in terms of the research.
Yeah.
So she's wondering what your process was.
Yes, so I had to do really a lot of research for both Jasmine and Rebecca. And you would think that I would need to do less research for Jasmine because she's Chinese and, an immigrant like me. But Jasmine was actually really difficult because I wrote her during the pandemic. I was not able to travel. I usually like to travel to the settings where the book will be set. Jasmine's backstory takes place in a rural village in China, and it was almost impossible to get the real details of what it's like in a rural village in China. There's a lot written about the big cities, and there are people from villages, but I couldn't get the kind of substantive, validated details that you need to write a scene. And in the end, there may be only 10 pages set in the book from that era, but they need to be right. You have to do it right. So I interviewed a lot of people, and finally I found a Cambridge professor who had done 2 years of field research in a rural village. And from her, I was able to get those details. Jasmine does wind up working in a strip club as a cocktail waitress when she's in New York. And that was research that I had to do as well. I used to be a professional dancer in New York City and in between my degrees at Harvard and Columbia. And surprisingly, the line between the professional ballet, Broadway dance world and the world of gentlemen's clubs is very thin because that's where they get the women from. And what they do is they tell you, come in as a cocktail waitress, not as an exotic dancer. Nobody will touch you. All you have to do is serve drinks. It's an easy job. You can kind of be insulated in your own little bubble. And, it's an easy job for a lot of money. Dancers are poor. They have to invest a ton of money back into their career. And it is all lies. Of course, it's not true. But that part I have extensive research on as well. Rebecca's publishing world career, of course, I'm an insider, and that was easier. But basically, every single part of the book, the penthouse she lives in, all the different worlds that the book takes you to, the underworld of Chinatown, the gentlemen's clubs, the exclusive high-class Park Avenue apartment. I did a ton of research and talking to everyone on every side of the equation. So girls who had been given away for adoption, girls that had been left and found, parents who had adopted them, daughters that had grown up in the West, families that had let their children go. I talked to everyone to write this book. And I know Angie did a ton of research as well.
Yeah, and I remember when you found that professor, you were like, oh my God, I'm so happy. So my research, so much of my research about the area, both in Northern Virginia, which is where this takes place, and also in Korea, are sort of from my own experiences. So that part was kind of the best kind of research for me, which is the kind of research where you live, and you have over the years that you have. And then as far as the non-speakers and also this world of Angelman syndrome, what was great about that was that, like Jean, it started with Zoom kinds of, meetings and interviews. But as the world was kind of opening up with COVID and things, I was able to meet a lot of these families. And the great thing was, then I started volunteering at this international organization that, by coincidence, happened to be 15 minutes from my house for non-speakers. And so it was amazing. So I now, for the last year or so, I've been volunteering, and I teach creative writing to non-speakers. And Happiness Falls was a Good Morning America pick in September, and as part of that, the crew came down to spend a day with me. And one of the segments that they ran in Good Morning America was them filming one of these creative writing things with, my students actually spelling out the messages to Juju Chang, who is the anchor, and she actually got so excited that she's actually going to do a longer segment for Nightline. And so, because she was just she was in tears. And the camera guys were in tears. And it was unbelievable, some of the things that they were spelling out. And so it was really amazing. And that, to me, is where it became less research and more just real life, which is just the best, kind of thing for it to do. So yeah.
Both of these books are incredibly well researched, and I think it is a testament to the work that's been put in. But it really shows in the kind of in the vividness of the stories as they unfold. So, other questions?
A question for Angie.
Yeah.
I love Mia's voice.
Oh,
She's such a
yeah.
compelling character. Where did that come from? Is that you?
The question is,
yeah.
sorry, the
No.
question is, she loved Mia's voice, and she wants to know where that came from. Did it come from you?
I think it probably is. My agent says it's definitely me. My husband says no, because Mia is so annoying, and I hope that you're not that annoying. So I'm not sure. But Mia, she is a lot. She is very, very intense. The first line, we didn't call the police right away. I think it gives you a window into her mindset, which is one of regret, more than anything else. And so I think her voice comes from, there's a lot of sassiness in that voice, and I think a lot of it is just guilt and shame and sort of her insecurity being masked by, her need to sort of analyze everything she did and didn't do in order to figure out, what could have been, what might have been. And so she is very intense, and my kids tell me that when I'm being annoying, that Mia's voice is like mine. So take with that what you will. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if the effort to communicate with this young boy, does this spell to communicate, which I assume is what you're referring to?
Yes.
Is that play a part of the book? And
Yes.
also, is it possible to access the video of you teaching writing?
So the question is, does the spelling to communicate feature in the actual book, and also is it possible to access the video of your teaching for these students?
Yes. So yes, spelling to communicate, S2C, and also rapid RPM, rapid prompting method, which is a different variant of that, are both real-life methodologies that I kind of combine to form a fictional method called PPT. And the reason I did a fictional method is because I didn't want people to rely on it and sort of go, okay, I'll do whatever she said to do in the novel, which I thought was dangerous, and I wanted people to go to actual, experts and things like that. But it is based on that, and it is a real life thing, and there are documentaries, like there's one called Spellers that's coming out, or I think it's already out, and the video of me teaching this class, there's a little tiny segment from GMA, so if you Google Happiness Falls GMA video, then there should be 3 videos, and one of them, the latest one, has that, and it's also on my Instagram. And then the longer segment is supposed to be coming out in Nightline next month, I think. Yeah, something like that.
So let's do maybe 1 or 2 more questions, because I want to make sure that we have time for the book signing. Yeah.
For Jean, I was wondering how you came to be an author, and also what your family's sort of opinion of you, how that has changed over the years.
The question is, Jean, how you became an author and your family's opinion of your work.
Yeah, it was not a natural choice for me to become an author. I think, like Angie was saying, as an immigrant, you're really so concerned with survival. My main thing when I was growing up was trying to escape that life at the factory. And I did love to read. I was really a devoted reader from the moment I learned how to speak English. But it wasn't an option to be a writer. I mean, I didn't even know you could do such a thing. And it wasn't really until I was at Harvard. I was a physics major at Harvard. And in fact, when Angie was doing her happiness quotient equations, I was like, Angie, that's not going to work mathematically. I was a physics major, and I was working on a problem set late at night. And my hand friend wrote a poem. And I was just like, oh my God. I was so shocked that I had written this poem. I felt like I'd laid an egg or something, you know. In fact, I just wrote an article about this that's appearing in The Guardian soon. But, you know, I was so surprised, but from that moment, I didn't want to be anything else. Like, to be a writer was, once I realized it was an option, it was absolutely the only thing I wanted to do. And my family, well, I mean, in some ways, I think they are proud of me. I think when my debut novel came out, Girl in Translation, which is taught in schools around the world, and it's very much based on my autobiographical life, they were...
And it's so amazing. Everybody should really read it. Yeah, it's so great.
Thanks, Angie. It's also being challenged across the U.S. because it's in schools everywhere, and it's about an Asian American girl. Anyway, so that book, when it came out, my family was like, "You wrote about our past?" And I think that there's a lot of shame from people who've come from circumstances like mine. But it did turn to a kind of pride because people are so very supportive, and instead of looking down for saying you lived in such tremendous poverty, that there is, you know, more feeling of pride. Yes, but we did, but we overcame it, and we are in much better circumstances now. But I think I will always be kind of the black sheep of the family. So.
Okay, maybe one more question. Yeah. The question is, why did you pick interracial adoption for the topic of this book?
Yeah, because the one-child policy in China was in place for almost 30 years and affected almost every single Chinese American, Chinese family, whether or not we were directly in the country or not, and yet nothing has been written about it. It is insane. I mean, there's nonfiction that has been written, it's been documented, it's been in the news, but in terms of fiction, I did not find anything, and it may well exist, but there's definitely not a whole lot. It has not been treated in our artistic and cultural life, and I feel that it's important for issues like this that there's a light shown on them, and also because from my own personal point of view, that feeling of being displaced, of being caught in between cultures, and of saying, what if, you know, what if I hadn't been adopted? And I think for us as immigrants, the what if is, what if we hadn't moved countries, right? What if I had grown up in Korea or in Hong Kong or whatever? I just thought it was just such a fascinating situation, and I wanted the story to be at the intersection of East and West, so that you have that really Eastern tradition, culture, etc., but you also have a very modern American woman who's got that adopted daughter, and what happens to them at the end, who actually gets the child, you know, who survives this, and what are the arguments on either side. So it really, really called to me. Also because I know people who were left on the side of the road to die by their parents, and were picked up by their grandmother who couldn't bear it, and yet then suffered, not because the family that took them in was punished, or, you know, or they had tried to hide it by saying there were twins. There were a lot of twins born if their kids were close to the same age. But there was so much suffering as a result of this. And one last thing is that, you know, that was a situation where Chinese women suffered greatly, and now the birth rate has plummeted to the extent that the Chinese government has turned it around and said, we need to procreate, you know, we need to have children. And the Leftover Woman is a reference to a propaganda campaign that is executed in China, that women who are so old, you know, 27 and older, are left over because they are not contributing if they're not marrying and having children. So somehow it is still our fault.
And I also think that it makes it so complex and layered because, you know, to your point before about making sure that Rebecca and Jasmine, that neither is the antagonist and the protagonist. I mean, the issues of race, like you could sort of say, well, you know, but there's issues of like, isn't it better for the child to be like with the same race parent? But then on the other hand, Rebecca is like so much more wealthy and she's secure. So then there's like the class issue that comes up, and isn't that better for the child? So it just makes it so much more layered, I think, and and it brings up those issues of race, and gender, and so I feel like that actually just like adds overall to the story. Yeah.
So, I mean, overall, you have two complex, layered, and very meaningful books, but also, this is a real treat, they're both thrilling to read. They're both great stories. So I really encourage you to buy these books. There'll be a signing in the back, and thank you so much for coming. It's been such an honor.
Thank you so much. Thank you.